just what has come to mind for each of you listening to each other's talks that have touched on some similar themes in some ways and very different in others. Trauma, conditions of threat, racism, discrimination, memory, the challenges of truth, spirituality. It would be interesting to hear what you've each been thinking about.
Well, I can start. Shelly, I just really loved everything you said, and it reminded me of individual and collective regard. You know, it brought to mind sort of this idea that you brought forward, Thurman's idea of the conditioning ground, that kept coming up for me over and over again, because I thought about how, you know, there are so many layers that we live with every day that mask this internal total regard, you know, and I sort of left off on this idea from my faith background around happiness being a birthright, right? And how do you actually get to that? And particularly when there are so many things that mask that potential. And I think about our current world, and you mentioned in your talk that Thurman's writings could be reflected in our contemporary newspaper, headlines, right, our news headlines, and I think a great deal about what is our contemporary climate doing to us every day. You know, how do we sort of cope with all that's coming and inundating us on a day-to-day basis? Just this morning, coming into Boston University, I was once again listening to reports on gun violence, you know, and so what that does to us affectively all the time, what we carry with us, makes it harder and harder, more challenging to get to that place that you're talking about, that inner core. And yet, at the same time, it's incredibly sustaining to withstand what we witness, experience every single day.
So I want to respond to that immediately and then make some connections. I think what I want to lift up from your talk was Thurman really was always working on the relationship between the inner and outer life. And he was often critiqued for being too interior, right? That people thought he was, you know, a contemplative who didn't have anything to say, that he was ignoring social justice, that he was ignoring kind of what was going on in the world. And he just kept coming back to, if you don't have this, everything around you, like all those external forces, are going to define you. So unless you've had that experience, or unless you have this kind of sense of total worth, or have at some point experienced it, you're just doomed to be defined by external, external forces. So I was really thinking about that when how do you mobilize when you were talking about that piece from Hindu philosophy, happiness is my birthright. My note here to myself was, how do you mobilize that religious insight? Like Thurman wasn't interested in just like, I'm going to just draw this from Christian theology or Christian thought because like we all have to adhere to this. He was interested in it as far as it helped people to kind of, mobilize this, like where they went. Like, I am being disregarded, and yet I have access. That's not totally defining me. And he actually learned this from Gandhi, right? So his trip to India was very, very significant. And he was so intrigued by how can people be spit upon and hated and train their bodies and minds and spirits to not either react, right? The nonviolent resistance, he was really interested in the techniques of that. Like, how does that actually work? So there's a point of connection there, I think, just in terms of how powerful his trip to India was. But I think that would be my question: is how do you mobilize? How might your community mobilize that religious insight as like an everyday, something you carry with you every day? I think that's just one of my musings from. But I think the big theme for me is like he was always thinking about intergeneration, like how do you deal with your generational inheritance? Yeah. Stop there.
Yeah, well, your question around how do you cultivate, this feeling of regard, total regard, happiness. To me, it really seems like part of that is speaking the truth, right? Part of that is naming it, and that's what Gandhi did. It wasn't like, there was nonviolent resistance. It was powerful, It was powerful to speak the truth, to name it, and to make it visible. In India, amidst colonization, Gandhi's philosophy was one philosophy, but there were many other philosophies that were part of the freedom movement. So I think that's also important to acknowledge, that it was nonviolent resistance, but there was actually just resistance, that was actually, violent. And it was, it was not a singular movement that actually transformed what happened with colonization, that there were multiple movements and multiple paths to naming the truth, essentially, and so there were these, and that's actually another part of Hinduism, is there are multiple paths to actually realizing the self-knowledge that you had mentioned, that that's in Thurman's writings as well. And so it makes me think a great deal about what is our conditioning ground? How do we work with the people who are talking to the youth, the second generation, the 1.5 generation, right? Who are the people influencing them, and what's being made accessible to those young people in terms of what they can say and can't say, and what they can do differently from the previous generation. Because I think that's actually critical, is to have a collective resistance that is pluralistic in their approach to naming the truth.
Yeah.
We should take a couple of questions from Dr. Laura Kaptari, a psychologist at the Danielson Institute, who's receiving the listener questions. Dr. Kaptari?
Yes, thank you to everyone who's submitting questions. Keep them coming. So first up, a question for both of you. Could you talk a little bit about how each of you understand and formulate trauma? Is this specific type of events, an individual's subjective experience, both, something else?
Do you want to start?
It's a big question.
I can start. Well, it is a big question, and it's been defined in many different ways. Maybe that's why the question's coming up, right? Trauma or traumatic stress is a response to an extraordinary event or a series of events or experiences. So personally, it's an internally defined and experienced type of phenomenon, that it's not something that I can define for you, somebody else, what was traumatic and what wasn't. And yet at the same time, we have some parameters around what we think causes more longer term traumatic stress, or even acute traumatic stress. In the context that I'm talking about with regard to racism, there are many different responses to racism, and I tried to illustrate generationally they might be different responses to racism and racial trauma. That for many first-generation folks, they don't like racism. They are stressed by racism, but they might also contextualize it differently, and their particular experience of racial trauma might be different in some ways than the second generation, who tends to have more cumulative experiences of racial trauma since the time that they're very young. So that the way that trauma is defined varies with context, but also in terms of personal experience within that context.
I'm appreciating this question because I used it in the PowerPoint and in the talk in a way that I don't usually experience it, which is like societal trauma, historical trauma, personal trauma, which really is a common way of speaking about kind of experiences that happen to you are traumatic. When really my operative definition is the kind of internal experience of what has happened to you, right? So I think the common way of thinking about events, like that was so traumatic or society is traumatic, doesn't really get at the phenomenon of how someone responds to experiences that happen to them. So if I had to rewrite that slide, I would say kind of not personal trauma, but just experiences, societal systems, and not using everything as trauma, but to really say it's an experience of of stuckness. It's an experience in response to personal things that happen to you, systems and structures. So I did some slippage in my own talk, and actually Thurman, I was kind of thinking, does Thurman? He's describing that phenomenon of how the internalized experiences. It is about outer forces, but it's also about internal processes and responses in response to what has happened to you. I hope that's helpful. I can't see the person who asked this great question, but.
Yes, thank you so much. So this is for you, Dr. Tummala-Narra. How does racial integration affect South Asian mental health and loss or gain of identity?
That's a great question. So there's been theories in psychology that suggest that the more you acculturate to a new country, that somehow that leads to healthier development or psychological health. And in fact, we know that's not necessarily true, because acculturation can also mean the absorption and the internalization of stereotypes that are actually harmful to oneself or to one's family or loved ones. So there's a way in which we have to think more nuanced, in more nuanced ways about racial integration, acculturation as part of that, and what that means to the individual. So when we think of racial integration, I think we have to think about what our specific experiences are in those interracial interactions, or what it means to be a multiracial person, a multi-ethnic South Asian, for example. And those are very, very individualized kinds of experiences. They also intersect with other parts of one's identity, whether we're talking about gender or sexuality, social class, caste in the Indian context. So all of those factors would, I think, contribute to what racial integration means for mental health for any single individual.
Thank you. And for you, Dr. Rambo, how do we guide people who have not had the inner experience of total regard begin to build up that sense of regard?
Yeah, I was stuck with this when I was writing, which is like, what if you've never experienced that? And right, because Thurman thinks it's always there, that it's you can actually come into experience of it if you haven't, through religious experience, if you haven't experienced it elsewhere. That's very complicated and a high bar for religious experience, right? I think he really tried to do this in worship, that he was cultivating a climate. If you talk about like in Marsh Chapel, in the Fellowship Church in San Francisco, what was he about? He really believed that you could craft a worship space in which someone could commune, right? He believed you need artists there. He was kind of, you need good art. You need music. You need silence. He crafted his words carefully. So I'm imagining he really thinks that if you can't find it anywhere else, you might be able to experience first in church. But he talks a lot about the child experience so usually he thinks it's in some experience of nurture that you might have had. For him, it was Grandma Nancy. Like, I could go through his chronology and be like, yep, that, when he talks about this, it's not just abstract theory, it's a person. Or it's the person at the train station. This is great. Like, he was going off to school for the first time. He had to go to high school outside of his town. And he's at the train station and he doesn't have enough money to pay for his bag, his luggage tag. You know, he can't, and some stranger comes up and pays that money. So these experiences kind of linger with him. They're not always warm comfort like nurture of the mother. They may be the momentary, like a moment in which a stranger kind of steps into and it, like, creates that climate for you. I don't know. I'm thinking with Thurman about it, but it's a high bar for religious experience for sure. That if someone hasn't felt this before, they may find it in church. Most often not, Thurman said, because Christianity is like heads in an opposite direction. He's very critical, but he's also after kind of recreating that or creating that for the first time for folks.
Great. So we have another question that kind of builds on that for both of you. This is from one of our participants who's a second-generation immigrant who moved away from an oppressive system of religion and so was raised without really any direct influence of religion. And they're sharing that now they've come to understand that this is a vast missing piece of themselves, their connection to spirit. So the question is, as clinicians, how do we deal with the exodus away from particular forms of religion as oppressive, while holding our understanding of the importance of spiritual realization as it's related to mental health?
Yeah, sure.
Another big one.
Okay, it's a really great question and such a relevant question that comes up over and over again, certainly in my practice and just in life, I would say. I think there's this experience that the person who's raising the question is talking about, which has to do with spiritual differentiation. You know, that in fact, if there was this oppression that was experienced in the context of a religious upbringing or institution or family or whatever it might be, that in fact that differentiation may have been necessary to actually begin to access something else in a religious or spiritual experience in some other way. Like Shelly, you had raised the point about the nurturing figure, you know, like who is the nurturing figure? Most often in my experience, when people have to separate, they're separating away from something that feels toxic or just feels oppressive, rather than something nurturing or growth promoting or just, you know, something centering. So I wonder, I think it's a great question of how do you then explore and allow yourself to explore other ways of being in your particular faith, you know, or your particular religious experience differently than what you experienced before. So it's an incredibly important point that's being raised. Yeah.
I mean, I deal with this a lot in the Christian context. You know, people call it church hurt, you know, and then they find themselves in other churches, and those ministers write me and ask, like, I'm inheriting all of this wounding from particular, from the last place. Like, I inherited it, now what do I do with it? And I actually do think Thurman, I'm just going to stick with him all the way here. He really understood how to shift into, you know, to shift vocabulary from the maybe doctrinal, in the, you know, very doctrine belief-based, to an existential mode of like, what are we really here for, right? The nurturing of the human spirit is not religion specific. So he calls theistic traditions back to a kind of sensibility of like, you've lost your way. And that actually people are trying to find their way back home. Like that's why they're coming to religious communities. So how do you make accommodations? I'm back to that language. Like, how do you make a home for the human spirit to not desolate, but I'm thinking what the opposite is. He would consolation, not desolation, but consolation. And he's working against Christianity and like with it, like often at the same time. It's really impressive, and I think helpful for church context in which you're using the same language, and you're nervous about being the rewounding site. That's what I'm hearing. It's like, oh, people are coming here. I'm going to rewound them if I use religious language, but this is a religious place. I think Thurman can be helpful.
Seems like home is an interesting theme, really, from both of
Yeah.
you, what you're touching upon, and the challenges of it, and the possibilities. Well, we're due for a break, so we're going to take a 10-minute break at this point, and we'll see you all in 10 minutes. Thank you.